Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we do not enjoy the cruel, cruel heat of the summer. I'm Anna Bogutska, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, welcome. You're catching us sweating through the UK's heat wave. Somehow, everywhere I go, it is now exceptionally sweltering, and I am not a fan of this. But we're also in the tail end of our teen horror season, which means that we're mostly now covering quite contemporary, very recent teen horror shows and films. And over the last almost 40 episodes, we've been looking at the teen horror subgenre and why teenagers and oftentimes teenage girls make for some of the most compelling protagonists and villains of the genre. School is almost out and we've only got a couple episodes left. And in this episode, we're looking at two very recent and very different aesthetically and tonally examples of this nostalgia for an era gone by. We're going to be looking at Summer of 84 from 2018 and Knives and Skin. And to interrogate this and dive deep into both of these films, I'm joined by first-time guest and longtime friend, the BFI South Banks film and events programmer Kim Sheehan, who is also the co-founder of Forever Young, a film club that showcases teen cinema. As per usual, please note that we spoil both films from the very beginning, so if you're concerned about spoilers in the slightest, definitely skip this one, especially around Summer of 84, but I do encourage you to seek out both of these films. And if you're interested in more Final Girls content, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at The Final Girls UK, and we are also on Patreon at patreon.com/The Final Girls. Our next Patreon special is going to be a deep dive into the new season of Stranger Things, in keeping with the nostalgia vibes and the teen horror of it all. But if you can't support us over there, that's absolutely fine. I would, however, really appreciate it, if only to make myself feel better because it is way too hot right now, if you could leave us a little review over on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I read all of them and they make me feel things. So I appreciate every single one of you who leaves a review. And with all of that said, and all the begging done, please enjoy our takes on Summer of 84 and Knives and Skin. Kim, we're going to start now because you're a busy woman and it's way too hot.
Okay.
But I have been trying for, I'm going to say 4 seasons to get you into the podcast. So I'm really pleased that this is finally happening, Kim Sheehan.
Oh my goodness. Thank you. I mean, I don't want to say I get loads and loads of requests to go on podcasts, but I get a few and they're all from you. So I'm really happy to be here finally.
I'm very happy to be your official stalker. I've been working on it for at least 4 seasons. And this feels, and when we met and when we started becoming friends and talking about movies, one of the things that I know you always loved is teen movies. So I wanted to ask you about, to start off, and since it's your first time on the pod, what is your relationship to horror in general and teen horror in particular?
Well, I think it's interesting, especially when you talk about our friendship, because it feels like this season you're doing is the perfect intersection of two of our real passions. You know, you are such a horror expert, and, you know, teen movies are my specialism and my passion. And I think that's where I'd have to start, really. I think I've always loved coming of age films and teen films. I think there's something quite magical about them, and it always frustrates me that they're not that respected. I think they're kind of in like the romantic comedy side of things when it comes to cinema and culture, where they kind of look down upon. Our teen movies are full of cliches, or they're really cringe, or they're really, you know, fantastical, but I think they're really, really special, and I've always loved them. And that is, I guess, has been my step into horror, because I wasn't always a natural horror fan until I kind of grew up and I got much older. I got into horror, I think, in my 20s, which I guess is quite late when you're getting into cinema. But teen horror was definitely a gateway part of that.
I feel like in the last couple of years, I was looking at, obviously I've been reliving my Stranger Things obsession with the new season coming out. And I was looking at when teen horror or teen genre started becoming a thing again. Like Stranger Things, the first season came out in 2016, and then the It movies, well, the first one came out the next year in 2017, became the most financially successful horror movie ever. I was wondering if you think that there is something in the air where teen horror is going through a little bit, or has been going through a little bit of a revival with those properties, and kind of not being looked down upon as much as teen movies have been traditionally.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I feel like perhaps the respectability of teen horror could go back a little bit further to something like Scream, where whenever someone does something quite interesting with a genre, which causes people and critics to sort of pause and take notice. And Cabin in the Woods, I think, was another one where that was sort of quite well respected as well. But I actually think I'm so glad you mentioned Stranger Things, because when you asked me to do this podcast and talk about these two films, Summer of '84 and Knives and Skin, the first thing I thought of was like, well, we can't talk about them without talking about Stranger Things, because it feels like Stranger Things kind of kicked off a little nostalgia porn wave, as I'd like to think of it, which these films like chime into. And I actually think that there's something about the nostalgia that made it so successful, and the same with it. I think particularly with teen films, and also with teen culture, it's always interesting that certain generations are nostalgic for a generation they missed out on. So when you look at that in teen films, you have things like Dirty Dancing, that came out in the 80s, but It's a Magical Holiday Romance in the 60s. And Peggy Sue Got Married, the same, that came out in the 80s, and it's about high school in the 60s. And then in the 90s, you had Dazed and Confused came out, and that kind of spawned off that 70s show, and everyone was nostalgic for the 70s in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I feel like Stranger Things came along at that exact time, and so much of that exact time where people were looking to be nostalgic for the 80s, but so much of the kind of big cultural touchstones in the 80s, the sort of the sci-fi movies, the Spielberg movies, the E.T., the horror, it just sort of really managed to be the perfect recipe of paying homage to all of them for an audience who were really interested in that era.
And also really reminded us of this very teen separation, the social stratification, right? Of you've got the weirdos and the outsiders, and you've got the popular kids. And I feel like Stranger Things also, part of this nostalgia porn wave, as you call it, is also kind of a glamorizing, or kind of focusing more on the weirdos and the outsiders more than ever before in teen movies. Like this is, focusing on nerd culture, or the start of it, the kids who would play D&D or go to horror movies and cosplay as Michael Myers. Like these kids who were really into their stuff, as opposed to being worried about the prom dance and whatnot, which kind of reframes the teen movies that that we know and love as well.
Absolutely. And I think there's a sort of, it's nostalgic, it's 80s culture, but it is fused with the kind of contemporary sensibilities around sort of inclusion and being yourself, being okay. And the thing about the characters in Stranger Things is that they're not changing. It's not like in classic 80s teen movies where it's like, I've got to get the makeover, or I've got to learn to be a better person to get the girl, or this sort of thing. You don't so much have that in Stranger Things. I guess you have I think is series 2 and 11 and 3 where she starts to engage with fashion and, you know, it kind of assimilates a little bit.
When she has a makeover with Max, which is a wonderful scene, by the way.
Absolutely. And I think, but that is all about enhancing herself. And Max, I think, says to her, she's like, well, it's not about what Mike likes. It's not about what Hopper likes. It's what are you? What do you feel like? So I think that's something that also really works for Stranger Things and has been a huge part of its appeal. And you're right. I think it's such a great observation, which is, yes, it's the kind of fun things about 80s culture. It's the fun pop music. It's remember these video games and a simpler time. People didn't have mobile phones and everyone went out on their bikes. It's kind of all that fun stuff that you say, but then there's this glamorization of like, you know, but with this, like I said, the sensibilities of today where it's like everyone can be included and everyone can be their sort of best selves and they're welcome here and they've got friends here and these are the real cool kids.
So it's kind of like a cleaning up of the nostalgia of the looking back, instead of focusing on how grimy and awful it must have been for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, does this feel like the griminess and the awfulness? Does that feels like a good moment to start diving into the first film of our double bill? And I have to admit, I'd always had this film on my to watch list, and part of the reason why I wanted to include it is in order to have an excuse to watch it, really. So let's talk about The Summer of '84 from 2018. And can you set the film up for us very briefly?
Absolutely. Even though I know you do this in all your podcasts, you ask the guests to summarize the film. I've not prepared enough. But
listen, you know what? I mainly do it because I find it so fucking hard.
I would say I know it, but the character names always evade me, even if I've written them down. But here I go. Here's my best shot at the plot of Summer of '84. So there's a sort of a lead character, a 15-year-old boy called Davy, and it's about the summer of '84 when he is doing his paper round, he's hanging out with his friends, but he's into conspiracy and his friends make reference to him having like theories about aliens and that sort of thing. And he stumbles across an idea, which is that the disappearances of teenage boys in the sort of extended local area that he's in, apparently there's been lots of disappearances over 10 years. He decides they're all connected, and not only that, but his neighbor is the one responsible, and he's living next door to a serial killer.
I mean, that's very good. Did you just come up with that right now?
Yes. And I feel like I missed some stuff out, but
it's
I think
very good.
That's a setup. That's not the whole plot. Obviously, we'll get into the plot.
I was just going to say, a teenage boy thinks he lives next to a serial killer. That's...
Oh, man, that's so... I did the long answer. I did all the working out, and you just wrote the correct answer in the box there. That's perfect.
No, I love it. So... this is kind of a really, you set up something really interesting about the main boy. And by the way, I will also always forget the characters' names. About Davy being kind of a conspiracy theorist and always looking for adventure or for something a bit more dark and sinister that's looming in the suburbia, right? Can you talk about our main boys, our protagonists, and especially Davy, and why he's kind of so intent on focusing on the darkness that might be lurking underneath something very simple and quotidian?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing. So there's like a 4 of these boys, and Davey's the main character, and he's got his sort of his nerdy friend, his kind of edgy friend who's got family problems at home, and then he's got his like faithful, overweight, sort of loyal sidekick type character. So I think the way that these characters and this setup and the dynamic that they have is very, again, it's nostalgic. It's a bit like a lot of teen horror films. There's always the kind of the gang of characters, and they all have different qualities, which allows them to be read really easily. It allows the screenwriter to use them really well. You have the kind of comic relief being provided by the funny one. The smart one, always surprise, has the exposition of, I'm going to explain what this chemical is and how we can use it to fight the bad guys. But then you always have at the center, you kind of have almost like the blank canvas heroic one that people can project themselves onto. And I think what is interesting about Davy, to this film's credit, is that he's not completely bland. And I think the fact that he's driving this thing of thinking his neighbor is a serial killer and this sort of thirst for adventure. And he has this bedroom where the wall is kind of covered in conspiracy theory, news articles and magazines and that kind of thing. And I think that works well as a trope, because the whole film is very much here comes a spoiler for Rear Window if anyone hasn't seen it, but it's a Rear Window setup, right? He becomes obsessed with this idea, and then there's reasonable explanations for everything, but are there? But no, there is, right up until the end, when obviously it gets very dark and it turns out that he was right. And I think that's interesting that, he's this character who's sort of, he's looking for this stuff. So naturally, you'd think the twist would be that it's not real and it's all in his head. But actually it is.
I actually kind of really loved the fact that the twist is that he is right. And I was thinking of Rear Window, because this kind of trope pops up a lot in teen-based movies, usually genre, because usually, it's like, oh, my neighbor is a serial killer, my neighbor is a vampire, or my friend is a killer as well, like Super Dark Times, which we covered on the pod, Fright Night, which we've covered here as well as part of the vampire season, Disturbia, which is a teen version of Rear Window, The Voyeurs, which is not really teen, but it's more like an erotic thriller, which is on Amazon right now. Like, this whole idea of, there's something really fucked up going on right next door and I'm the only person who can see it. It's so perfect for teens, because teens would usually not be believed.
Yes.
Even if they have a lot of credible evidence. So the fact that actually these teens are correct, in the same way as the protagonist of Fright Night was correct, his neighbor was in fact a vampire. How well does the film work with the idea of the killer hidden in plain sight?
Well, I just want to take us on a little bit of a side road real quick. Because Rear Window and films like this always remind me of one thing, which is if you're a Simpsons fan and you watched The Simpsons a lot as a child, as I did, do you remember the episode Bar of Darkness, which is the Rear Window parody?
Vaguely, yes.
Well, it's a Rear Window parody, and Bart is he breaks his leg, he gets a telescope, and then he starts spying on Ned Flanders. And it's exactly Rear Window. There's all this suspicious stuff going on. It looks really obvious. He sends Lisa around to sort of figure it out. And the end result is, it's totally fantastical. It's all easily explained. Maud had gone away for the weekend, and Ned Flanders isn't a killer, a wife killer, and everything's all good. And I watched that as a child, and then for so long, I actually assumed that's how Rear Window ended. I didn't actually I thought there was a twist where it was like, he didn't murder his wife after all. And it wasn't until I was older and I watched Rear Window, and I was like, and it almost became like a double twist for me, because I was expecting it. I was expecting it to be like, oh no, Jimmy Stewart, he got it all wrong. And then when it turned out he was right, I was really shocked. So I always think about that when
Kim, I love this so much. I fucking love this so much. I am so happy you had that experience. That's beautiful. It's so sweet.
I genuinely think there must be quite a few kids like me where if your first touchstone of Rear Window was a Simpsons parody, then Rear Window is a real shocker and a real surprise for you. And I always think about that when I watch films like this. And I've kind of... I needed the ending. I needed the ending to sort of scratch that itch for him to be right because of it. But also, I think it chimes into something that I think I'm going to probably talk about this with both films, with Knives and Skin as well, which is teenagers like to watch films in which the teenagers are right. The teenagers are misunderstood. Oh my God, yes. The teenagers are misunderstood, or they're more mature than the adults, or they're more mature than the adults think, because that feels like a really beautiful vindication when you're that age, because you're trying to be an adult yourself, you're trying to step into that world, and so often you're being kind of held back or warned by adults who are saying, no, you're not an adult yet, or you don't know this yet, or still listen to me, I know better than you. And it's really frustrating. So to consume media that kind of says, do you know what, like the teenagers are the smart ones, is just, it's just beautiful. People love that, and I think that's that kind of chimes with both films, actually, that the teenagers are the ones who are right, or the ones who are more mature.
And what do you think of Mackie as a serial killer, both before we find out that he is actually one, and when, you know, the twist is revealed, the fact that he is actually a threatening figure?
I think it's really well done. I can't remember the name of the actor, but he is from
Rich Sommer. Yeah.
Yes, and he plays such a lovely good guy in Mad Men, and I love that kind of casting where it's like, oh, casting against type type thing, or casting with type, because you want at the beginning you want him to be like, well, he's a friendly neighborhood cop, and what I really like is the way that the film introduces him. That sequence where he calls Davy over and he's like, please help me shift this table into the basement. And you're watching this is the, you know, your first introduction to these characters, and you're just like, oh my God, don't go with the random man to his basement. Don't do that.
I mean, yeah, Davy, have you not seen enough movies? Like, this is how you get murdered, child.
You say you're into conspiracy theories and obsessed with murders, but you're just walking straight into what could potentially be a murder. But then, you know, obviously the film plays with that, and it's it builds on it. You know, he goes into the house and he's like, help me move this bit of furniture. They get into the basement. Oh, we've got to go further into the basement. We're going further into the darkness. So it kind of, it's like, you know, pushing and pulling where you're like, oh, is he okay? Oh no, is he going to be okay now? But ultimately, in that first segment, you know, Mackie comes off as a good guy. He's just a guy in the neighborhood who needs help moving his table. So I think he's done really well, and I think he's portrayed sort of really well. That you do have those moments of, no, he's probably fine, but then he's almost, you know, he's friendly, but then he's too friendly when you see the way he interacts with his parents, with Davy's parents, when Davy's dad drags Davy around to Officer Mackie's house and is like, apologize to him for thinking he's a serial killer, and Mackie's all like, oh, don't worry about it. You're like, oh, he feels really sinister in that moment.
Everybody thinks that. I've just got one of those serial killer faces, you know? Which exactly. He does.
He does, but he didn't have it so much in the opening, or you weren't sure. And I think that's why he's done sort of really well. You know, if I'm being absolutely, you know, kind of really critical about the film, I feel like when he's at his weakest is right at the end, the sort of, you know, kind of epilogue where it turns out he was hiding in the attic and then he takes them out to sort of finish them off. And I feel like in all that stuff, I feel like it's a little bit weak for me. I think it goes, obviously it's emulating a sort of nostalgia for a slasher film, but I don't think when he's sort of baiting them and torturing them in the forest, that's when the kind of cracks seem to form for me in that performance.
That's quite interesting, because I like, one of the things that I really liked about the film that really worked for me was actually in Rich Sommer's performance. He's got that sort of physicality that can either be really, really warm and approachable, or like good guy style, or really sinister, because, and I mean this with no disrespect, he looks like almost every serial killer ever. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you look at the cast, there's two physicalities that we associate with serial killers. One of them is the kind of hulking, you know, big Ed Kemper, kind of big bear kind. And then the other is a kind of hyena, like really small Charlie Manson type physicality. And again, I mean, with no disrespect, because I think Rich Sommer is a really handsome fella, but he does, you know, he can turn it on and off in that sense. And obviously the context matters a lot, but he's so lovely and approachable, but under the right lighting and in the right scene, He's incredibly sinister, and he almost seems bigger. He seems larger, more hulky, more menacing, because even that smile and that kind of very warm face and demeanor that he has turns real creepy.
Well,
really quickly.
I feel like I found the most menacing was when he was like, you know, with the father, like I was saying, where he's in those scenarios where he's playing both those roles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was just when it got really overt for me at the end, where it was like, oh God, he's pulling them out of car, and I think for me it's maybe less of a criticism of his performance, but this sort of beat of the film, for me, I think at that point I was just like, oh, we doing this? And also, and this is silly, and this is like just total personal emotional response, but I was kind of pissed that they killed Woody at the end, because he was such a lovely faithful sidekick and was just mercilessly had his throat slashed for me, which felt for no reason at the end there. So that broke my heart a little bit.
Yeah, but you gotta kill someone.
Why Woody?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you that. I'll give you that for sure. I did really love his speech. I know it might be a little bit too on the nose, but I love the actual menace in there. You know, the whole, I'm not gonna kill you now. I'm just gonna make sure that you live a long life looking over your shoulder. Like, you're gonna live half a life because I want to toy with you for the next 20, 30 years.
Oh yeah, that's sort of perfect. It's a perfect boogeyman thing, and it's going back to honestly, we're going to say the word nostalgia so many times in this podcast, but going back to nostalgia, it's that, you know, it's the leaving the doorway open. I don't think it was a film that was ever intended to have a sequel, but most of those sort of teen horror films of the 80s do leave the door open for a sequel. And I think it was definitely a really effective way of doing that.
And I do wonder, and you know, both of these films feel like summer films, and maybe I'm just thinking about kind of summer horror because it's incredibly fucking hot right now. But there's this thing that Mackie says that I wrote down where he was like, oh, you know, I remember what it was like to be a boy in the summer. It's hard to pass up an adventure. What do you think kind of about the summer moment that plays such a big role with teen films in general, I think, but a lot of them are also horror films?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, I think for teen films, it's that the summer is always the penultimate time. You know, it's the time for kind of freedom. You're liberated. You're not in school, and it's a kind of a long period. So it's for young people to have life-changing experiences, or you can reinvent yourself in the summer and come back to school a different person, or you can meet a new friend in the summer and it can change your perspective. Like that's the kind of the beauty of the summer, and I think it's often used as a device in coming of age films for that reason. But also, I think from a kind of practical plotting point of view, the good thing about the summer is that the kids are on their own. You know, the parents, the adults, they just kind of become on the fringes, and it's a bit like this in Stranger Things as well. I think, I can't remember if season 3, I think, is set in the summer, the one that's kind of based around the mall, because you can effectively pull away from the adult characters, which I think is quite important, not just for coming of age, but for horror as well, because so much, it's that classic thing, isn't it? It's like, well, why wouldn't they just tell their parents that they thought the guy was a serial killer? Even though that works really well in Summer of 85, but I think it's just as a kind of a device, it just liberates your character somewhat. And it's interesting because even though it has a kind of summer vibe, Knives and Skin is set during sort of term time, so you have that thing where the kids, they have to go to school and they have the regularity of school, whereas something like Summer of 84 is kind of less constrained by that.
You've led me into my next question. So what sort of role do adults play in this? Because obviously the big interaction, the big interplay is between the kids and this one slightly sinister man that lives next door to one of them. But what about the other adults?
Well, I think, like I said, they're very much on the fringes of the story, and I think it's the tricky thing about Summer of 84 being a film. It has that constraint, whereas, you know, something like Stranger Things being a miniseries, there's so much kind of space to explore all the characters. But I feel like the adults in Summer of 84, they're sort of absent adult tropes, as I was talking about, that you get in the summer and teen films, and the bits that we see of them, I feel like they're not quite meaty enough. So Woody, the overweight sidekick character, he has a mum who's an alcoholic, and you sort of see him taking care of her, and he makes references to taking care of her, but that doesn't quite go anywhere. One of the other kids, I can't remember his name, the kind of more edgy one, he has a sort of a kind of very his home life is his parents are fighting, and he makes a reference to how in danger his mother is, of like, you know, I think he says something like, I don't want to be the witness to a murder suicide, which is why he doesn't want to go back home.
Yeah,
which sort of talks about the, you know, the extreme nature of what's going on in his household. And again, it's not really explored. And I think perhaps what's happening with those adult characters is you know, they're there to show why they can't have faith in these adults, or they can't really trust them. Like, who can they turn to when they think that they've got a serial killer in their midst? The adults are either, you know, not trustworthy or just not useful enough.
Well, and it's also this thing of adults just thinking that the kids don't notice. That they're not noticing these things happening around them and how they're affecting them. And I think it's a nice moment to kind of, before we start wrapping up, to talk a little bit about Nikki, who is the only sort of female character in the film. And her parents are also, her parents are getting divorced. And that's one of the things that she opens up about and kind of bonds with Davy about, even though she starts as basically someone who they all have a crush on and very slowly becomes a human being. In their eyes. But there is also, I want to ask you, what do you think about Nikki, and also about this kind of recurrent trope, particularly in coming of age and in teen movies and in teen sex comedies too, of kind of a light stalking peppered throughout the film?
So I'm so glad that you've made Nikki a talking point in herself, because Nikki, I think, holds me back from enjoying the summer of '84 to like its kind of full potential. And you sort of covered it in the question there, in that, so Nikki is the sexy girl next door. She's a teenager, an older teenager. She's very much set up as older and out of the league of these 15-year-old boys. However, she does interact with Davy, and you said she kind of becomes a human being. I would argue against that, maybe, because I think she becomes the fantasy of a teenage boy. She sort of slips through his bedroom window, walks into his house, and is like making herself at home. And he says something like, "Oh, you know, I've seen you in your bedroom window, but I've never seen you naked." And she, says, that's a shame, I've got a great body. And it is so like, oh my goodness, that is a teenage boy's fantasy of a response from a girl. Like, no girl would ever say that to a 15-year-old boy who's been spying on her. So the boys, they do the sort of voyeur thing through the window, and yet when she's confronted with it, she's like, oh, so charming, and I'm flattered in a way. And I just don't think she ever gets developed beyond being a teenage boy fantasy. And I was trying to think, and I don't know if I'm giving the film too much credit, because I didn't know, is this part of the nostalgia that she is so two-dimensional, and she is like, it's funny how earlier we talk about Stranger Things and saying like, oh, it's all the atmosphere and the vibes and the culture of the 80s, but the kind of glamorous sensibilities of today. And I was like, well, is Summer of '84 just really double downing on the nostalgia and being like, well, do you know what? It was just like this, and this is how we treated women. And what's interesting is, before coming onto the pod today, I was doing a little bit of kind of reading around about the film and refreshing my memory, and I went on Letterboxd, and the most liked review on Letterboxd is from the director Sean Baker, director of Red Rocket and The Florida Project. And his take on the film is, he said, oh, this is so authentic, right down to the way that the boys talk and how they talk about women. Like, this is what we as boys were like in the 80s, the whole I fucked your mum and stealing a National Geographic because there's a boob on it, and this sort of thing. He's like, this is just what we were like and what it's like. So I respect that, and I'm like, not feeling let down by the language and the way that the boys talk about women, because yes, that's boys will be boys, but I just felt like this character who could have had a bit more steel about her, the way that and I also, it's kind of almost made a joke in the film, right? Davy is hanging out with her, and then his friends don't believe him, and his friends don't believe what happened between them. And at one point I thought that was going to be a twist, because I didn't believe him. I was like, is this his imagination? And it wasn't. It's reality in the film, but it feels like his imagination because it's so unrealistic and she is so two-dimensional.
That's a really excellent point. No notes. Absolutely. Fuck, that's actually really interesting. Sorry, I'm a little bit speechless.
Oh my goodness.
I do wonder, kind of based on what you just said, I don't actually know. I don't really know how to feel, whether it's on purpose, the recreating of nostalgia, even with the darkness of it, even with the dark bits. Because if you look at the teen stuff, teen horror and teen movies in general from the 80s and even the early 90s, it's very, very stalkerish. It's very, very locker room talk vibes. It's your Porky's and all the influence that had. And that, I think there are two very interesting video essays by YouTube video essays called Pop Culture Detective. One is called The Ethics of Looking and the other one is Stalking for Love. And they're both about kind of this, first, the trope of kind of stalking, especially stalking a woman, being kind of a trope of romantic movies. And that's kind of been accepted as a form of courtship, not as actual stalking. And then kind of the ethics of looking, of that there's always, it's how we privilege kind of a voyeurism even within the story of us looking at characters that don't know that they're being looked at. And I think this happens a lot here. And I think I don't know if the film is doing it on purpose as a kind of commentary on that, Sean Baker commented thing of, oh, this is just how we were until we realized that, hi, hello, women are also human beings. Or if it's a narrative flaw, if it's kind of just embraced and internalized those tropes so much that at no point does Nikki need to become a human being. I was a bit softer on her perhaps because so much time is spent with her talking about how her parents' divorce makes her feel. But it's in the interactions with the other boys. It's essentially like that moment in, is it 16 Candles, where Molly Ringwald's character gives her underwear to the Anthony Michael Hall character and be like, I know you need to prove this to your gang, to the boys, so here's my underwear. We both know nothing happened, but I'm gonna let you pretend for the public that something did.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's another example of, it's female character written by a man, where you think about it and think, would we be so generous? Would we be so flattered by that kind of attention? Or would you just be absolutely creeped out? Please get me out of the car ASAP. And I need to get a really thick blind to make sure my 15-year-old neighbor isn't staring at me with his friends. It is. I think that's interesting. I'm glad you sort of you brought up those video essays and that point of view, because I really was on the fence where I couldn't decide whether this was, I don't know, an intelligent look at the trope or trying to kind of come to terms with, like, it's all nostalgia, it's all homaging stuff, but some of it's more pleasant to think about than others. And I'd like to think that's what was, an attempt was made at that, but it just didn't quite kind of pan out. And I also feel, I don't know, like, it's interesting hearing your response to her as, she's this figure and she's going through her parents' divorce, and that's kind of really tough. For me, that I didn't quite respond in that way. I kind of felt like that was just more layers to her in the kind of manic pixie dream girl way, where it's like, oh, I'm so sad. I'm so sad in my life. I just need something that makes me happy. Maybe it's my 15-year-old neighbor, like... Yeah. Why doesn't she have any friends to go talk to? And, they make a joke out of, and that was another thing where I couldn't decide whether it was a fantasy or not, because his friends, they say, she's really into this guy's brother. He's 20 and he works at the hardware store. And then when he asks her in their, like, one of their exchanges, he's like, are you not interested in this guy? And she's like, no, he's 20 and he works at the hardware store. As if that's like real negative to him. And it's like, well, she's much older than them. She's sexy, she's glamorous, she DJs at the club or whatever. She's got a lot going for her, but she's really sad inside, and she just needs a little 15-year-old boyfriend.
It's because he's the only person she likes in the entire town, Kim.
Exactly. That you're right. That is a line she says in the film, and we're supposed to swallow like it's real.
So I think it's time for us to move on to Knives and Skin. And same as with Summer of '84, can you summarize the film for me briefly?
Okay, yes. So Knives and Skin, it starts off with the sort of story of Carolyn. Carolyn is a beautiful, blonde, wholesome schoolgirl, but we catch her, she's in the middle of what seems to be a sort of secret liaison, a secret hookup with a guy from the football team. He mentions he has a girlfriend, and there's sort of a lot of sneaking around that's going on, and they're meeting up at night at the sort of edge of this lake, this sort of foresty area. They're making out, and she decides she's not that into it anymore and tries to kind of stop it. He gets angry, he sort of hits her or pushes her down, and then just drives off and leaves her there. And then she disappears, and not just disappears. Literally, the trace of her body we see on screen just evaporates into air. And then the film follows her classmates and the people in her life and how they handle her disappearance.
Again, beautiful. And I love that you mentioned kind of the supernatural element of this up front, because it's really hard to call this film a specific type of genre. I quite like, it's been called dream horror. It's been called teen horror, which is why I included here, a mystical teen noir. It's been talked about it with reference to David Lynch's work a lot. It's been called like a teen Lynchian film. What's an appropriate way to frame it for you? Like, how does one even start to enter into the world of Knives and Skin?
Well, that's one of the beautiful things about this film, is that it does fall out of convention and genre and tropes so much, but also sort of embracing them in another weird way. But I do think my favorite description is the mystical teen noir. I think that is perfect. I think that does kind of capture a lot of the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. But it is also 100% David Lynch as a massive inspiration for this. I think there's some really clear Lynch reference points, particularly Twin Peaks, which are obvious. I think Carolyn has the whole Laura Palmer vibe. She's very, beautiful, blonde, and kind of quite wholesome. However, there's something darker about her, and she's sneaking around with this other guy, and there's like some other side to her. And I think also in the whole town, there's the kind of Twin Peaks vibes, in that like everyone has their own idiosyncrasies. Like every adult is a bit of a weirdo, which is so David Lynch. And I also think there's this humor in Knives and Skin as well, which I think I'd forgotten after I saw it for the first time, but then when I caught it on a rewatch, I was like, gosh, it's like there's lots of this kind of beautiful, absurd humor going on, which is very David Lynch. I think one of my favorite characters is the conspiracy theory mother, Andy and Joanna's mother. I think it's actually a weirdly wholesome portrayal of someone with a mental illness that doesn't punch down too much. She's got a few things going on, this woman, and you can see there's tinfoil cushions around, and she doesn't feel like doing things. She needs to have a nap because the vibes are off. But also just the delivery of some of her lines and the kind of deadpan humor that goes along with it feels like a very David Lynch thing. So I think the Lynch influence is probably the strongest essence of the film that you can kind of grab hold onto, but everything else in terms of genre is, I think, very much subverted. But mystical teen noir does a good summary for me.
And I'm glad you bring up the conspiracy theorist mom, because we do actually spend quite a lot of time with the adults in this film, almost as much as with the teenagers, especially with the mom of Carolyn. as she's dealing with the grief of her daughter disappearing. How do you think it balances kind of this, focusing on the teenagers and focusing on the adults in this town?
I think it balances it really well, and it's almost like the inverse of Summer of '84, where the adults kind of on the fringes and almost stock characters in a way, or they have one quality about them. Like Summer of '84, you have that alcoholic mother, and that's it. She's an alcoholic and she sleeps and there's nothing else really going on, whereas Summer of '84, they're also richly detailed, but you're right, it is in a way where it's a balance and they're almost as important as the teenage characters, and they have their own lives and they have their own subplots going on, and they interact in different ways. I think my kind of next favorite character, I guess, would be the mother of Carolyn. I think she is done so well, and it's such, considering the film has a lot of characters in it and it's very multi-layered and there's a lot going on, I think it's such a beautiful, sensitive portrayal of grief, and especially how she interacts with the teenage boy, who's the last person to see Carolyn alive. So yeah, I think that the adult characters are just as richly drawn out as the teenage characters, but again, going back to the sort of the David Lynch of it all, interestingly, again, it's like Twin Peaks, where the adult characters are so messed up. They are doing, crazy things. None of them have their lives together. None of them seem to be able to explain to each other what they really want. Whereas the teenage characters are much more mature and have a better shot at doing that. And it takes us kind of back to that Summer of '84 thing we were talking about, where like there's something so appealing about a teen movie which says, hey, teenagers or young people watching, you've got it. You've got it together. These adults, they don't.
One of the things that's really interesting to me about this film is that there is no right or wrong way to be an adult or a teenager in this film. It really actively refuses to place its characters in those kind of tropey boxes that we know and kind of love or accept, at least from teen movies. What do you think about the way that what do you think about the high schoolness of it all? You mentioned at the start of our chat kind of the fact that even though this very bad thing happens, this classmate of theirs disappears, they still have to keep going. They have to keep going to class. Even the mother, who was their choir teacher, has to keep going through the motions. So they're constantly still having to go with the everyday and with the day-to-day of their lives. And in the high school, but the tone, the mood of the high school has changed completely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the sort of the stock characters, because I think what the director Jennifer Reeder does really well, and why this is an interesting film to look at in comparison to Summer of '84, is that she takes like the essence of nostalgia, but she plays with it and turns it into something else. And I feel like that's there with the stock characters. She has stock characters, but they aren't the ones that we're used to seeing, and they're subverted. And I think you can't talk about Knives and Skin without talking about the wonderfully diverse cast that she has. But in a way that the diversity of the casting and the diversity of the characters in this story doesn't feel like a tick box exercise. It doesn't feel like a diversity exercise. You have this sort of the popular princess is she's a black girl. She's the sort of head of the cheerleading squad. But then you have other characters. The characters in the band, you have a Muslim girl, but she's a punk and she's styled sort of accordingly. And these aren't just the kind of side characters who don't really get a look in. They're at the center. And it's not just sort of diversity in race. There are queer storylines as well that kind of running along in the center of the film, but not in a way where it's like, oh, well, make way for the white heterosexual people who are actually the leads. And these are their friends who dip their toes into diversity in different ways. They're all sort of richly a part of the story and at the center. So I like that's she plays around with those stock characters. And I think she also, when it comes to the jock, the football character, he's probably the most like his stock character, but the thing that she really does is sharpens his edges and makes him very realistic. Like, a lot of this film is about the violence the violence that boys and men inflict on young women, and she does not shy away from that with his character.
Yeah, I think you're very right with the Jock character in particular, because there is absolutely no part of him that is forgivable or likable. Like, nobody even tries to pretend that he is unpleasant and nasty to everyone. And kind of the big, there's often a big confrontation moment in teen movies, and there is one here as well, but it does not come as a surprise. Like, everybody had already been sort of avoiding him. He's already kind of a despicable character, but here it's in no uncertain terms when he's just told, no, you treat women, you treat girls, you treat women like shit. You can't fight for it. No amount of like popularity or anything can deny what everybody knows, and nobody really backs him up either.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think it's interesting because in a way, you know, going back to the how Jennifer Reeder sort of plays with the essence of nostalgia, but doesn't double down on it like the summer of '84, is that you know, the Jock character sort of traditionally in teen movies, he is redeemable, as you say. You know, you have in The Breakfast Club, he's it's just a masculine front and he's really a softie underneath, or you know, or the Jock character could be misunderstood, but he's a real prize in John Hughes movies, whereas yes, in here it's absolutely, you know, it's realistic. Like, I think she made this film at a time. I think, I can't remember if the documentary Red Roll came out before or around this time, but I think it was a time when people were really looking at the toxic masculinity particularly in American high schools, and the way that teenage boys treat women, and how it's often, I don't know, often in American culture and society, it's like, boys will be boys, and those rascals. And actually, no, it's incredibly fucking dark. They hurt women, they rape women, and in some cases, they murder them. And that is, like, she absolutely confronts us with that and that character, and it makes no efforts to, soften his edges.
I love that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Jennifer Reeder too, who is such an interesting filmmaker in general. And a lot of her work, especially in short films, has really honed in a visual style, but also thematically, she's always been very interested in teenage girls and their worlds. And I wonder, how would you describe, kind of, what do you think of the mood that the film creates? I think, you know, it's overused now, but this film is, as the kids say these days, a complete mood. And
complete mood. Do you know what I thought you were about to say, which I think is overused these days, but I feel is, you know, really well done, possibly pioneered in Knives and Skin, is bisexual lighting.
Yes, it is.
Jennifer Reeder is like, bisexual lighting, let's go. You know, there's so many beautiful scenes that are just paved in pink and blues and purples, but done really, really well.
Yes.
But sorry, that's where I thought you were going.
I wasn't, because I'm going to disagree with you. I don't think bisexual lighting was pioneered here. I think it's way back in the 80s that they started doing it.
Not pioneered, then celebrated.
Well, maybe
it's the nostalgia again. She's playing with the nostalgia, the little bits of nostalgia, but in a way that it feels sort of contemporary and fresh.
And it's got the same, but very different, but not dissimilar aesthetics as Promising Young Women, in the sense where it's very girly, but there is a darkness and a grotesqueness to that hyper femininity. You know, the pink lighting, all the little knickknacks, all these worlds in teenage bedrooms, the iconography, like the clothes iconography of high schools, of the cheerleaders, of the band squad, like the jocks, everything. And even with Carolyn's mom, she kind of starts almost trying to feel her daughter through her objects as she's trying to process everything. So I was wondering, kind of, what do you think about the aesthetic and the mood that this film creates?
I love it. I think it's the strongest, most fun thing about this film, and it's a film that's very strong in other areas, but I absolutely think it's the jewel in its crown. What I like about the sort of the style and approach of Jennifer Reeder is it feels like she is mixing so many things that she's interested in, But again, to compare this to Summer of '84, she does it in a way and gives it a quality in that it's almost timeless. Like, I remember the first time I saw this film, I was like, wait, where are we? Where is this set, and when is it set? Because the fashion is so sort of beautiful and chiming into different eras, but there's also some cassettes are being passed around. They make reference to listening to records, and I think it isn't till like a good portion into the film that you see the first mobile phone, and obviously it's a smartphone, and that kind of anchored me back to where I should be. But it gives it this timeless quality, which I think, even revisiting the film, I don't think it's dated. I know it's not that old, but it still feels very, very fresh.
I really love this this hyper feminine grotesque style.
Yes.
I really, really dig it, because it is essentially, even in the music choices, which we haven't really mentioned, the choir of teenage girls singing these pop anthems. It really reminded me of what a lot of the stylistic choices also in Promising Young Woman, even, the funereal orchestral take on Britney's Toxic as well. Can't get enough of that, because it kind of really shifts the mood of something that we're told is very light and unworthy of attention and unworthy of discussion. And here it becomes so sinister without the thing itself actually ever being sinister.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad we're going to talk about the choir songs, because I absolutely love that as a device. I think these days, slowed down pop songs are definitely very much overdone in cinema.
Yeah.
When new trailers drop with a different spin on an old 80s classic. But I think it's done so well here. I think it's done so beautifully. I think my favorite bit is where they do New Order by Blue Monday, and it's that opening line, how does it feel to treat me like you do? And obviously Blue Monday, that's such a banger, and you love to sort of shout that line in a club or whatever, but when you hear it sort of sung like that, and it's sung over, they're looking for Carolyn, they're going through sort of combing the field or whatever it is, but it's also when one of the other characters gets physically assaulted and pushed down by a boy, and it's sort of this beautiful, not heavy-handed, but kind of a subtle epitome of what the whole film being about, the kind of violence that's inflicted on these young women in this culture. And I just think it's such, the way that Jennifer Reeder deploys these covers isn't just in a fun, these 80s songs, and isn't it fun that they're being sung in a different way, and it's part of another sort of nod to nostalgia. I just think they're so well placed, and in a way that makes you appreciate the song differently, consider the lyrics differently. I think it's done perfectly.
And to start wrapping up, you mentioned at the start of our conversation that the double billing of these two films felt very appropriate to you. And I was wondering if you could expand it, like, how do you think Knives and Skin and Summer of '84 talk to each other?
Well, I think it's interesting in a way that we talked about right at the beginning, where and when you said Stranger Things, I was like, I'm so glad you're talking about Stranger Things, because I feel like you can't talk about these films without it, because I think they are, like I said, the nostalgia porn wave, they came out of it. And whether, I'm sure these films were in development potentially before Stranger Things, and maybe even in production while Stranger Things was airing, but it definitely feels like Stranger Things opened the door for, hey, do you know what's hot and cool? It's coming of age, but it's like set in the 80s, and it's horror, and it's sci-fi, and it's supernatural, and this is what the kids dig now. And then the sort of films coming out so quickly, so I feel like they're connected in that space, and obviously they're sort of American indies as well. But what I thought was another interesting parallel when talking about them and considering them was, I've talked a lot about how I think Knives and Skin is very much about the treatment of girls and girls coming to terms with how they have to negotiate their lives with men and predators and violent men. And it's interesting that in Summer of '84, there's the sort of essence of that, but it's presented in that, in that wink, wink, boys will be boys way, the way they talk about women, the way they spy on the neighbor. It's sort of like, oh, ha ha ha, but that is a seedling. That's a sort of, an unhealthy culture that can turn and blossom into the horrible teenage boys that you see in Knives and Skin.
Mm-hmm. I want to thank you because this has been a really amazing conversation.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for having me.
And before we wrap up, Kim, is there anything that you wanted to add about either of these films that we haven't covered in our chat?
If you legit just give me a moment to check
some of my
notes. You know what? I genuinely don't think there is.
Great!
I feel like we said it all.
We said it all. This is the definitive interpretation of Summer of 84 and Knives and Skin. Kim, thank you so much for your time and for your insight. I hope it was a painless first podcast recording for you.
I think it was, but only because it was you, Anna.
And where can people find more of your work online?
Oh gosh, online. I'm barely online as much as I should be, but I'm the most regular place to find me is probably Twitter. I'm on there as Kim Loves Films, all one word, but I'm also on Letterboxd and Instagram there as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.